Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. We are joined by a wonderful guest who we'll introduce in a moment, and hopefully we're going to be joined by another one very soon. They're on a different time zone up there in Scotland, so let's see what happens. Hopefully the second person will be able to join us very, very soon. And if he does, he might just be an angry Scotsman who's about to come in and disrupt what we're into. But that's all right. We're okay with angry Scots people disrupting things. We're also okay with disruption. But it's another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. We are on that countdown to the end of the year, and we announced very, very recently that we have been asked to be a media partner doing podcasts at Bet in January. So if you listen to this before January 2025, here he is, the legend, Mr. Cameron. He's here.
I know, how the flip I can't go into this on my bloody desktop. Complete fucking mystery.
Yes. Well, we're here, and we're live in the studio, and we have been joined by the real David Cameron, as well as the wonderful Mick Waters, both of whom have been on the podcast previously to talk about the amazing work that they've been doing in education over many years. I say many years. I don't want that to sound disrespectful, but you know what I'm saying, right? But we are really, really excited today to be talking about a book that they've both been instrumental in pulling together, and that is a book which is a tribute and a call to action. It's called Unfinished Business, and it's about the life and legacy of Sir Tim Brighouse, who, again, we had the privilege before his passing to have on the podcast, and I know that his influence has been incredible, and we are very much looking forward to speaking about Tim's legacy, but also what we can do, because these two who are on the call for us now are encouraging us and challenging us. And I came down, just as a little bit of a side note, as a bit of an intro, I came down to the book launch. Steve was on his way, but had a tyre blowout, I believe. So never mind. All things come around in the end anyway. And the people that were talking about this book and the stories that were being told, I was absolutely blown away. I'd known a little bit, I've read a little bit about him, heard a little bit about him, but the people and the lives and the stories that he was talking about, I'm very much looking forward to continuing the legacy. But as you said, David, as I remember very, very clearly, that he would be furious that we've written a book about his legacy if we weren't really talking about, we need to do something about this. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So Mick, David, thank you for joining us on a podcast. How are you?
Good. Apart from being utterly ashamed that Tim managed to get onto your podcast and I couldn't blooming work it. I'm there having to do it on my phone. And normally, if I was trying to do anything techie with Tim, I could only see half his head. So, it's always a struggle. So you've shamed me.
I know what Steve's about to say anyway. Steve's going to remember when Tim and Mick came on and Mick, you'll remember this, won't you? You remember that. Steve, tell that story, because it's one we still talk about this all the time.
I just remember, I think it was Tim couldn't find a good location in his house, and was he like his grandkids or somebody was going to be joining? He's like, I can't do the whole podcast from here, so I'm going to have to find a space. And then Tim and Mick, for probably what I think sounded like a half an hour, but it was about 5 minutes, just absolutely ripped into each other, like clearly the friends they were. And I was absolutely in stitches. I was like, and we were just messaging behind the scenes thinking, if this is how the podcast is going to go, this is going to be unbelievable, because these guys are literally leading education, have been doing it for many, many years at so many different levels, and create this vision of leadership, but also just showing the way in how to have fun while doing it. I think in this sector, how many times do people launch books, work in education, lead change in different authorities at national level, and you always go and you think, I respect them, but this is going to be a tough conversation because you have to act in a different way. And I was like, these people are our people. I was like, so down to earth, so grounded, and could just take the piss out of each other.
Was he walking around the house like trying to find the best Wi-Fi signal? Is this better? Is this? We're live on a podcast. But it was just brilliant. Like, loads of people have come back about that. Just the fun. You're right, absolutely. The fun, the stories, and also, like you said, that light-heartedness about something that's really important. But that's not diminishing the importance of how we ensure that education happens. And I just want to recount one story from that book launch before we get into this. I know I've mentioned one already, but there's one story that really resonated to me. And if actually it's more stories of multiple people talking about the notes that Tim used to send to them, and he'd regularly have notes that would land on their desk and a little card of something that, and he'd go away and he'd write these little notes. And I was massively inspired. Like, there's something that when I was in school, I used to write home postcards to kids on a regular basis. I'd leave on a Friday, and I got out of the habit of doing writing encouragement notes and letting people know that what they were doing. And I was massively encouraged in that session to go, right, this is something I need to start back doing again. And I just thought, somebody who is a knight in the realm, and I bet he hated that as well. If I'm getting it right, the fact that he has had such high profile across multiple different disciplines, multiple different cities, and had such a massive influence, yet would take the time to get his pen out and write a little note to them. That tells me, I think, as we get into the story of this man's life and the legacy that he's left, but also what we need to do with it, that's the kind of person we're talking about. Is that, I presume that's what how you remember him as well, Mick, right?
Well, that's exactly how I remember him. The sense of fun was enormous. We spent a lot of time together and laughed most of it. Now and again, we had to deal with really serious problems, but always trying to do the right thing at the right time for the right people. I mean, it is interesting that thousands of people have said they've got notes from Tim that he wrote to them. Some have kept them for 30 years. It's incredible. And the amazing thing is that hardly anybody can read any of them. His handwriting was so awful. I think one of the sort of attractive things about it was the fact that it took you 4 years to work out what it said, and then you held on to it because it had been such an achievement to read it. But the fact that he'd bothered to write really did matter to lots of people. So yeah, it's a really quite astounding thing. It looks like David's given up on us.
Yeah, he could be there, he could not. He could be trying to still log in from a browser.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think he's trying to find Wi-Fi. He couldn't find that seat that Tim was sat in.
Exactly the same.
I was trying
to find the volume. I couldn't hear Mick. I thought it was the attendance crisis spreading to Scotland, but it looks like he's appearing again. The mystic Bobby Cameron.
Well, to be fair, it'll probably record itself and do itself out in the edit anyway. So it's all wonderful. So maybe this book obviously is available. And by the way, I don't know if you spotted on the camera, everybody, what cup I'm drinking out of. It says Be More Tim. And when we went to the book launch, we got a mat, and this has got loads of coffee stains on it, as you can see, looking, if anybody's watching this, because it sits on my desk and it reminds me every single day about being more Tim. And I wonder if David, you maybe first talk to your first stories and remembrances of, or what was it about Sir Tim? Because if you remember when we asked you who's your biggest influence in education, without hesitation, you said Sir Tim Brighouse. I remember that part of our interview all them ways back in when we had the first conversation. So, David, tell us a little bit about the Tim that you knew.
Well, Tim was my hero before I ever met him. He was a role model, I think, for lots of us who were trying to do the same kind of work at that time. I was head of education, and I remember hearing about the Birmingham Guarantee. And he was talking about making sure that kids got to the theatre. He was talking about entitlements that children had. He was talking about rights that people had. And there was a real sense of responsibility and service in everything he spoke about and did. And I'd heard about the notes, I'd heard about the humanity, I'd heard about all of that. And a bit like you're talking about, Ben, I just couldn't believe it when I finally did meet him. Let me be clear about the meetings. I met Tim a few times, but apparently didn't reckon much on me. And it was only when I finally met him at a conference in Northern Ireland. He was chairing it, I was speaking at it, I did my keynote, and I sat down, and he said, "That was effing brilliant." And I said, Lord, take me now. Tim Brighouse just told me I was effing brilliant. And it meant the world to me when he said that. He then said that he was going to stop taking bookings and he was going to get me to get them instead. And I thought that was wonderful and flattering, but he actually did it. And that was the amazing thing about him. He was just so open. He was just so down to earth. He was just so humane. He was kind. He was generous. He was clever. And some of the other things that really struck me about him was I'd never known anyone that had such clarity and self-belief aligned with humility. He knew exactly who he was. He had a profound sense of values, but it didn't make him arrogant. It made him certain. It made him confident. It didn't make him arrogant. And very importantly for me, it didn't make him dismissive. I think lots of people who are very certain are prone to being dismissive. They don't give others credit. They don't listen. And Tim did. One of the comments that's made in the book about him was that we talk about him being a brilliant speaker, but actually he was a phenomenal listener. And that was one of the things that really informed his speaking. And beyond that, I mean, there are just so many stories about him because he was Tim. He was an individual. He was a person. He transcended his role. If he went into a classroom, people didn't feel the need to kind of bow the knee or whatever, no matter how important he was. He came in always as an equal. He came in always as somebody who wanted to learn. And these were the things that, as I say, really struck me about him. And that moment of effing brilliant will stay with me for the few remaining years I have left, I have to say. But if it had happened earlier, it would have stayed for longer.
It blows you away, doesn't it? That the amount of people, like you said, that is that have made that he's left notes for, the amount of people that he's influenced that know him now or have met him or would class him as a friend or he has supported. I was just looking back at the book, and I think it's 12 pages of people that wanted or managed to contribute to the book, but actually you could probably write a book of contributors based on the amount of people that would have wanted to be in the book or wanted to do it, not because it's about amplification of their own brand or persona or person, but actually because he really supported them. And I think the thing with Tim is you look at those individuals that have an individual and a personal story, but actually the book tells stories and we tell stories of actually influence of many people that might even not be aware of Tim because the influence he had on Birmingham and London and at national level and global level for young people, for teachers, for educators, for leaders, they might not have ever heard that name, but actually he will have done so much to really influence and support them in terms of their journey. That is what a legacy that is. And, we'll all tell stories, but ultimately there's people that will tell a story about their education career, and Mick and David and other people would listen and go, I think Tim's probably had a part because I understand that that's what he would try to achieve.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. The strength of Tim's influence was massive, and the spread of it was enormous. I mean, in the book there are 64 chapters, and we could have had 200 chapters. When David, Steve Mumby, and myself set out to write it, we decided we would edit the contributions of others, and because it was Tim, we were desperate to make sure we got a range of different contributors. So we've got names that people will recognise that have been around for a generation, but we've also got teachers from classrooms. We've got teachers who are doing fascinating work across the country in different ways. And it was difficult to come to 64 people because we had to make a manageable book. But equally, it was easy to pull the book together because so many people wanted to write. They were quick to get their submissions in. We had nobody that we had to chase. We got the thing turned around in a very short time. I mean, it's a year now since Tim died. It was a year this month. And when you think the book was produced and Crown House, the publishers, did an amazing job to get it published, but it was produced by October. We're hoping if anybody's listening to this and hasn't yet got a copy, please do buy one, because the proceeds go to charity, and we're trying to leave Tim's legacy both in action after we've got the money in for the book, but also the legacy and that call for action. We were trying to get people to think education can be different, it can move forward, and Tim was always looking to make education better than it currently is. That's why improving on previous best was always one of his watchwords, that we've got education working, but come on, we can make it better than this. So most of the chapters in the book, after the first 9, the chapters are people's ideas on how we make aspects of the world of teaching even better than they are.
I think that's really powerful, and it came across in the launch. But in reading the book, you imagine that a book like this is going to tell all the stories of the years and years in those places, and like Steve mentioned earlier, some of the places that he's had incredible influence. But actually, it's just 9 chapters. Yes, we've got to do that because it would be wrong not to. But the real legacy, the real power in the story is the fact that it is unfinished. And the book's called Unfinished Business, and I freaking love that. It's like we've been talking about this phrase. I feel like we've been talking about this phrase for years and years and years on the podcast about this. The idea that education is an infinite game. It's not something that we have an end to, we've somehow finished, and now that's done and we're done. It's an iterative process, isn't it? It's a fact that we've got to keep thinking about what's next. And as I'm reading through these different chapters, I'm thinking to myself, wow, there's different. Like I get all excited about. Oh, there's a little bit of technology here that can support with this, and we can do this new curriculum and pedagogy work, and we can do some work around wellness and inclusion and accessibility. But actually, as you put them all together, you're thinking, this is a big job. It's a really important responsibility. And some of the people that have talked here, talking about joy, I love Professor Deborah Kidd's work on joy. We loved interviewing Deborah. Like, before she became a nomad and decided that she was just going to do cool things all around the world, right, and find real joy. She was talking to us a little bit around that, and I wonder if something that I really wanted to touch on today is asking that question around. You talked about there, Mick, and your chapter you talked about improving on previous best, which is one of Tim's mantras and the way how we kind of lived that. And obviously there's a thread throughout this around school improvement and the development of schools. And we interviewed both you and Tim about that, your book about our schools. I was trying to find something to keep my door open the other day, and it's the only book that absolutely could keep my door open. But it could also, I imagine it should have a license because it's an offensive weapon. If you could use that, you could do some real damage with it, right? Build houses with it, keep doors open, and assault people with it. But in that, and in this one, is this idea around school improvement and that continuous improvement. I wonder if we can maybe talk at that, because it's got a bad rep, hasn't it? Because improvement almost always has to start with inspection, or has to start with seeing where we are. There might not be the word inspection, but an awareness of where we are in order to be able to think about improvement. I wonder if you could maybe talk at that first, Mick, and then David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, this word improvement is one of those that some people blunt from. In the About Our Schools book, Tim and I argued that education had improved massively over the previous 50 years, and that it had changed in fundamental ways. However, we also said that it had become too centralised, too sort of focused on the market, and too managerial. Most schools have got incredibly managerial now. And what we needed was to look at a new era. We thought the centre couldn't hold for much longer. This was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And we sensed there was an emerging era of hope, ambition and collaborative partnerships, that people were wanting to see education as something based on hope as well as effort. And improvement's a fascinating word. People want to improve. The point of education is to help young people to develop and grow and improve the world in which we live. So we're not frightened of the word improvement, but sadly it's been used in a different context over quite a long while now. I mean, there's endless fuss about Ofsted. in England, and there has been for many since 1992 when it began. But we've got this fuss about whether you should have grades and whether you should call things by single words. There's all sorts of things we could say about Ofsted, but actually, if we took it that every school started from a position where it wanted to improve, it required improvement, that would be a good starting point for some of these inspections, wouldn't it? What improvements would help you most? What improvements would really help the youngsters in your school to achieve the sorts of things you're looking for on their behalf? And stop it being a nasty word, but turn it into a word that professionals really want to achieve. Improvement for us, for our children, for our school. Schools should always be looking to develop because society is developing, and we've got to be part of that on behalf of the children and young people that we're trying to educate. So, yeah, we're not shy of the word. We endlessly thought improving on previous best was a good way forward and a good starting point for people. It's not a calamitous word at all. So the book is based on what we can do to improve the education system, what we can do to improve schools, what we can do to improve society on behalf of children, and what we can do to improve children's lives in every respect. And some of those calls for action, those chapters, are just full of ideas, but also full of tangible things people can take back to their workplace and get on with. David's talking, but he's forgot to put his microphone on.
He's gone. His microphone's
He's
gone.
He's there, but he's not there.
He's like...
He's going to start smashing some screens up in a minute.
If anybody's just listening and can't see the video of David getting really angry, hopefully he can calm himself down before he comes in.
Do you know?
He's got jealous of that story about Tim walking around with a laptop, and he's not going.
It's gone.
I reckon what he's going to do is he's just going to get a copy of About Our Schools just to smash his screen up. No, is he there? No, not yet. No. But I suppose you jump in at any point if you can hear us, David. You jump in at any point when you can get back in. And while we're there, I think one of the things that I'm keen to hear from you, Mick, is about what does this look like in practice? Because I imagine I didn't know him as well as you do, and to be fair, I wish I'd have had. You look back now and you think, if I'd have been just got it a little bit sooner, I'd have been around some of these. But we talk about legends in our lives who have supported us, and one of our heroes passed away not too long ago, David Price, and who I know you'll know, and he was a real powerful influence on both mine and Steve's lives. And in that conversation, he was regularly just saying, "Okay, well, what do we do with this? What do we do with it?" He was talking about that open thing. You talked about open earlier. David talked about it being open. I was reading Chris Kilkenny's chapter in the book, which I love, by the way.
Oh, that's lovely.
If you didn't see that, if people haven't read that, the title of that chapter is The Fucking Legend, and we're cool with that, right? And he said, I have to call it that, and David said, I need to call it that because that is how it sums up. And he talked about how Tim listened to him, and just like David was talking about. But I'm wondering, like, in terms of like the action, what does this look like on the ground? Because yes, we're talking about leadership, we're talking about governmental, we're talking about policy, but what does the unfinished business look like for a teacher on the ground? What can we do to maintain this and create action that makes a difference?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. It's a coincidence, isn't it? Just before we began this morning, I'd been looking at David Price's book, Moving Forward, it's called. And I'd written a chapter in that for him. And he was such a terrific bloke. I mean, while we're talking about Tim and the legacy he left, David Price was just a lovely man who cared so much, achieved so much. And he was another one who was trying to push on the door of progress and open the door of progress for people, at seeing teachers as fundamental in moving the system forward. So when you say, what does it look like, in terms of the teacher in the classroom, what moving forward like? I think every teacher really aims to be the best professional they can be. And what progress and improvement look like is always seeing today as a stepping stone to tomorrow, not in a negative, oh my goodness, I've got to lift my game yet more, but looking for opportunities and ways forward. Tim used to talk about finding holes in hedges. It's a phrase he coined from a book by one of the people in the resistance in the war. But the idea that if you could dodge through a hole in a hedge, you could get somewhere quicker and more easily than taking the normal route. And one of the things that's happened over recent years is that teachers have been encouraged not to always look for themselves to try and make the system better, but to do as they're told. I mean, in About Our Schools, the book was so heavy. Tim and I talked about the way in which teachers are, if we're not careful, will be turned into technicians and operatives, doing what their branch manager, the head teacher, tells them to do, which is what central office government tells them they ought to be doing. And of course, children, teachers, schools are different in so many contexts that we've got to be more nuanced than that, more sensible almost than that. And the belief that research-informed practice ought to begin in the classroom with teachers finding ways into solutions to what we might call old challenges. Now our old challenges have been there since schooling began. How to get every child to learn is something we've never solved. So what it means for a teacher in a classroom is to retain the joy of being a teacher, to be honest, and to be endlessly inquiring, to be the sort of person who's intrigued by why some things work brilliantly and others don't, or some things work brilliantly one day but not the next. Be intrigued by the job they're doing and enjoy sharing that job with others. I mean, when Kenneth Baker developed the national curriculum in 1988, and what he did was to take politics into the school. That was the first time the politician had entered the school. Schools did their own thing until then. And in 1988, the national curriculum took politics into school. And in 1997, when Blunkett and Labour took the national strategies into the system, they entered the classroom. And what's happened in the last few years with particularly Nick Gibb is that we've not only entered the classroom, we've got politics on the child's desk, telling us how children should do subtraction, telling us what children should say at the beginning of sentences with their little fronted adverbials and so on. And when you get that close to the child, the danger is you not only factored the teacher out, you've factored out the child, you've factored out the learner in the process. And some of the stuff that's being produced at the minute centrally, if we're not careful, will factor out teaching. And teaching's the most powerful profession. It's the most gorgeous profession in that we change lives, we make lives better, we make children the sorts of adults we'd want them to be, and we're trying to make the world the sort of world we want children to inherit and influence. So somehow we've got to see for teachers in the classroom that this book is a call to action. That's why it's a book you can dip into. You can just sort of open it at any page and start reading. And some of the ideas you'll disagree with, some things you'll find not appropriate to your school, but there'll be plenty in there that you can talk about with colleagues and work on with colleagues and take forward in the way that matters to your school and your children.
Still on mute. He's done all that effort and he's still on mute. If he can,
he's still miming. He's got nothing to say really. He's just
what we'll do is we'll get him to write down all of his thoughts and we'll just put it in the show notes. So he'll come back at some point. But yeah, I think Tim, the work that the book does and everybody around him is around teacher empowerment. But I think individual empowerment, you've just kind of really gone into the detail there, Mick, about really everything in education across all of the structures is just compliance. Everything is around doing to, being told what to do, and there's no autonomy, there's no leadership is not autonomous anymore, or is a real challenge, especially because of the structures that we've created systemically and actually in the clusters that we've got. I think teachers don't have that autonomy to lead their own classroom. I think learners are not having their own autonomy. constantly. You only get so many questions, and and been told what to do. And I'm like, what does that do to us collectively as a education organisation, but also just as a community of individuals, where really we just can't think for ourselves because we're just used to being told what to do. I am an employer, and trying to bring those people in often, trying to give them accountability and autonomy in terms of my leadership style is often really difficult because they're so used to compliance and just being told what to do. That's something that you've really got to spend time with now, because they're just not used to really just using their own navigation and their own compass anymore, because they've always been just told what to do. It's just so worrying for me.
I think this goes back to one of the earlier questions that you asked. He said, almost pretending that he'd been in the conversation all the time. You talked about the starting point being inspection. And I think one of the problems we've got is the metrics and the whole idea of accountability. I mean, it's been fascinating looking at the latest information around the Progress 8 results, because a lot of the trad schools, the warm strict schools, however you want to refer to them, have done astonishingly well in terms of that Progress 8 score. And that's now become a rallying cry. Lots of stuff on EduX or whatever, just about that. And what can we learn from these schools? And if you only apply a single metric, it's always going to take you down a rabbit hole. And we're now into a really interesting conversation, because I think compliance, rehearsal, revision, all of these things can make a significant contribution towards getting kids through tests and exams. It can make an enormous difference to progress. It can make an enormous difference to attainment. But does it help kids to get beyond that? And that's the point I think you're making, Steve, is that we're actually looking to get young people who can think for themselves, who are not simply compliant, who don't simply do what is asked of them, but in Tim's terms, they're capable of discretionary effort, they're capable of making decisions for themselves, and they're capable of providing a better future than the one we've created for them. The degree of self-satisfaction we've got from people like Nick Gibb around where we are, as if to aspire to be where we are was a worthy aspiration. Whereas where we are is in a world, riven by climate change, where truth is a casualty, where opinion holds the upper hand at every turn, and where we are seeing conflict, we are seeing an incredible degree of disruption and damage. And in order to sort that, we need more than Progress 8 improving. We actually need to get to a stage where young people can do the attainment and can think for themselves. And I think that's one of the great things about Tim and one of the great things about the book. Mick said it earlier, there are chapters in the book you might disagree with. You talked, Ben, about Chris Kilkenny's chapter, which probably would never get into any other educational book of this kind in the known universe, right? You're not going to pick up any book from John Catt or whoever that's got a chapter in it called The Fucking Legend. It's as simple as that. But you get it in Tim's book, because he recognised that power of bringing people together. He recognised that power of looking at different metrics, at looking at a range of things. But one of the key things always in that was to go and look and find strengths. The purpose of inspection, in lots of respects, for Tim, was to find the starting point. It was to find that place that you could stand in order that you could change the world. And that's one of the differences, I think, that we've got a culture which says, find what's wrong, fix it, rather than find what's right and build on it. And I think that's one of the really big and profound debates that the book's trying to start up. Where can we find common ground? Where can we find purchase? And where can we bring people together with different opinions to make change that will work in the best interest of humanity? It's as ambitious as that, as well as just individual improvement.
I hear this, and I think this is bigger than schools, and that's what I get here, is that this whole conversation is bigger than schools. It is about what do we do to schools are a starting point for a lot of people, because that's we've lived and breathed that world, right? But we know, and I know that you, David, and everybody's background in this call actually have done more than just been working in schools or working in education policy. We've worked in that social care space. We've worked in that charitable sector. We've worked in the things to support people that are beyond just getting across a curriculum and then somehow being able to pass that on a test. And you mentioned that phrase earlier, David, about the question needs to be about what are the metrics, and we're measuring what. Sometimes we measure things that don't really matter, and I get it. We've got to think about certain things, and we've got to have rigor. We've got to have that. And in fact, interestingly, the fact that I suggested that the starting point of school improvement is inspection, honestly, it hurt me saying it, because I am probably right now right up there with one of those people that says this system needs to be of inspection as is, needs to be torn down. And I know that everybody's in the same space with that. One thing that I want to maybe pick up on here is, and it's in the book, and I know it's in Tim's, and in that book launch, it came across very clearly that Tim actively worked hard to be inclusive, and how he championed people from different ethnicities, from different, how he championed women, how he championed those people that had been forgotten about in society. And in fact, that really stood out to me. I was like, this is amazing. Like, people talking about their experience, even as a male, pale and stale, which has dominated education for as long as it has. There was a very real sense that inclusion, accessibility, and the space that everybody fits. It kind of fits to that point that you were talking about in being humane, right? Being just a good human being who gave a shit about different people. And Howell talks about that, about botheredness, right? Mick, is this something that you saw in what he did, and is that something that how we can continue that going forward?
I think you're right. At the launches, there were a lot of people talking about the way Tim had affected their lives, their career, the way he'd welcomed them from a different ethnic background into a community that at the time hadn't seemed to be the sort of place where they belonged. And they'd forged a career since then in a world that previously had not seemed for them and now seems absolutely right for them. And they have seen people like them join the profession, make a difference, take on responsibility and so on. And Tim, yeah, he was inclusive and always embraced argument. David talking earlier about his qualities. I mean, Tim and I used to talk endlessly about the fact that when we met people, interviewing them for our previous talk, we had, at the end of it, obviously, when people had gone, we would sit talking about what they'd said, and we were sometimes discomforted by the people who were incredibly certain and dismissive of other views. And Tim was never dismissive of other views. He would struggle to agree, but he would always try and see the point that they were trying to make and where they were coming from. And that's why in the book we've got people who if you like, Tim and they probably had really heated debates about what education's for and how we should manage it and how we should see it going forward, because we didn't want the book to be a series of people offering eulogies and tributes. We wanted it to be a call for action. And what we have to accept is that we need autonomy of thinking in the system. I mean, a few minutes ago we were talking about autonomy. It's one of the great sleights of hand, isn't it, that Michael Gove said, let's have academies so everybody can be autonomous. And now if you talk to people who are in academy chains, so many of them say, I make few decisions and I basically pass instructions on to others, whether it's head to teacher or teacher to child. And there's something that can't sustain in that. We've got to give people the power of thought over themselves, so that, you know, at its sort of main point, our children need to be able to think for themselves, act for themselves, think for themselves and act for others. And we've got to get to a point where people are encouraged to think rather than simply to act. And Tim was the sort of person who tried to say, just think a bit further down the road and realise where some of these policies might take us. He'd said that to a head teacher or a teacher. You're all excited about doing this, but there are downsides. And it was an encourager, but it was also moderate. He would think, hang on a minute, this might lead us to somewhere that we're not intending to go. And it was that open debate that was really part of the way he managed his own professional life that we tried to bring out in the book. We want people thinking about this book, not just reading it. We want people taking action, but really knowing where they're trying to get to, why they're trying to get there, and not going on thinking into the future, but really working out what education's for and what we're trying to achieve, and then doing something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just fascinating in that, we talk about football players, rugby players playing with their heads up, and being aware of what's going on around them and being aware of the whole game. And we talk about that as being a remarkable quality in a sports person. And Tim educated with his head. He saw the bigger game. He saw that it was about much more than simply results. And he saw education as being both noble and ambitious. And your point about inclusion, Ben, I think is interesting, because unless we take that issue seriously, then we're not talking about equal opportunities. We're certainly not talking about the possibility of improved outcomes. We're talking about leaving children hostage to their legacy, hostage to their circumstance. And I think Tim understood that. And one of the quotes that I use is that, we're all products of our past, but we don't have to be its prisoners. And I think there was a key message in there that Tim was a breakout specialist. He was somebody who recognised that, we all bring our past with us. And he spoke often about his past. He spoke often about what forces had shaped him, and how his experience of school had given him a particular view, because his experiences led him to see that school could be a liberating force, not a conditioning force, not a controlling force, but a liberating and an enriching force. And he brought that to the way that he governed, if you like, in education. He brought that same sense of liberation. He brought that same sense of enrichment. He brought that sense of trying to find and recognise potential and then build on it. And for too long, people haven't seen the connections that there are around. I mean, I've been talking a lot about this. It's no coincidence that under the last government, we had some of the most draconian legislation against protest. And we're still seeing it. We're seeing a woman going to be put back into prison because her wrists are too thin to sustain an electronic device. For goodness sake, what is that about? But it's actually, culturally, it's the same. And it sits alongside the continual attack on the cliche of woke. Now, if anybody was woke, it was Tim. Because he had that sense of tolerance, of inclusion, that recognition that everyone had a part to play, everyone had a right to be part of society, everybody had a requirement to find a way to work with others and to collaborate. He recognised that bigger picture, and he built a vision of education around that. And one of the things that Mick's doing, I think, more powerfully than anyone else at the moment, is to make this argument about the need for that sense of purpose in education, that clarity about what it's for. And as soon as you talk about it being for ennoblement, for enrichment, for change, for liberation, for creativity, as soon as you talk about it for all of these things, it takes you into a different world in terms of procedure, in terms of teacher training, in terms of the kind of metrics and accountability that we use. And it takes you into a language of poetry rather than accountancy, which is another cliche that I trot out all the time. We've got trapped into this language of accountancy in education, benchmarking, target setting, progress, all of that. Now, there's value in that, and nobody valued data more than Tim. But if we only talk in the language of accountancy and neglect the language of poetry and transformation, we are selling the potential of education desperately short. And that will lead to us failing our children, failing future generations, and living with regret, I think.
Agreed. You stunned us into silence. I think we could definitely talk hours and hours and hours. I'm conscious of people's times, and I know that we could do part 2, 3, 23 of this, and the 63 chapters in there, and we could, all of them are worthy of a podcast conversation. In fact, actually, as I was reading through this, I thought, there's a few of these we haven't had on the podcast. I need to reach out to these and get them in. We'll have podcast content for the full year and beyond. If we do, I'm inspired always, I think, by people who have been going in the same direction for a long period of time, against adversity, against the challenges that sit in there. And yeah, we always like to finish our podcast with quick fire questions, as you are, as you, both of you, I think, will remember. Certainly David will remember, and we've changed them up, so you can't say who's your most inspirational person. You can say Sir Tim Brighouse. You can't say that now, so he's gone. We knew that was going to be the answer. So Steve, do you want to kick us off with the first one?
Absolutely. Okay, so we'll come to you first, Mick, and then David.
David's left because he didn't want to answer.
I think I've gone. Can I still hear?
You're still here. I can still hear you. I can still see
I
you.
went dead then. I was like, oh my God, has everybody booted me out? What's one outdated educational practice that we need to abandon?
Norm reference in exams. That if exams were organised on a criterion basis, that if children could take exams when they thought they were ready, and if children could put themselves forward for bits of exams, as it were, to accumulate certification, you would see a changed attitude in young people immediately. And if you change norm reference in exams, you'd change the metronomic nature of schooling, you'd change the ridiculous hundreds of hours that children have to spend learning the content for a 6-hour examination period. Yeah, norm reference in exams. I could give you 15 more if I had time.
I managed to find a new way of screwing up there and dropped out the call entirely just before the quickfire round. So I missed the questions and I missed Mick's answer.
So the first question that Steve asked was, what's one outdated educational practice we need to abandon? You can't hear what Mick said, so let's see if we're on the same page.
I'm more concerned at the moment with the, not outdated, but the increasingly inflicted practice that we've talked about. I think the creation of the technician teacher and that whole response to teacher shortage and everything else is the one thing that we need to get rid of. We need to get back to teaching as a proper profession.
Love it. So the second question, I'll come to you first this time, David, just in case you drop out first. And then we'll come to you, Mick, is how should we measure learning success beyond grades? It ties to what you talked about. How do we measure learning success beyond grades?
And one of the great approaches was a piece of work that was done in Scotland for years by the Centre for Educational Sociology. And what they did was they tracked cohorts and they tracked them through school and beyond school. And one of the key metrics that was part of that was what the destinations were. And I think if we could begin to look longer term, rather than always looking at the hurdles, looking how well young people continue the race once they've cleared the hurdles, the exams, I think we'd start to get real progress.
Mick?
I'm ever so sorry, I listened to his answer and forgot the question.
The question was, how should we measure learning beyond grades, or measure success beyond grades?
I think grades are okay, as long as they're criterion reference. What matters, I think, is where you measure learning. At the moment, we measure learning at the individual child level. and scale it up when necessary, or we measure it at a national level and measure it in PISA terms against other countries and scale it down from there when we feel like it. I think what we should do is measure educational success across communities, across towns and cities in a different way. So at the moment, a school can be seen to be not succeeding when it's dealing with all the children that nobody else wants. And the schools that are so-called succeeding are succeeding because everybody wants to get there, because everybody says they're succeeding. And until we see schools communicating with each other, collaborating with each other, working together to support each other, and not measuring success across individual institutions as though it was the school that made the only difference, I think we're not facing the future properly.
Okay. Last question, and you're going to make him quick fire this one. Are we ready? What one thing would you want our listeners to remember?
Humanity. I think that the big thing for me coming out of this conversation this morning is that need to be human, to recognise that young people are more than just products. The education's not transactional, that it's a human process, and that we're trying, and however cliche, motivational it might sound, we're trying through education to do what Mick talked about, and that's to make the world a better place than it currently is. And my God, we need to do that. So let's remember the humanity. Let's remember that need for bread, recognising all that the child brings and all that we can offer, and trying to put these two together.
One thing I'd sort of comment on is the notion of somehow balancing the concepts of purpose and joy. It's absolutely vital that we work incredibly hard to get the best we can for every single child in the system. And Tim really worked hard. People talk about the things that he did that he would have thought were on the periphery of his job, sending the notes. He worked incredibly hard at what needed to be done, but he always did it with joy. And, in the system and in the world, if you work hard, but if you have enjoyment, but you don't achieve very much, it's actually not very rewarding. But if you work incredibly hard and you enjoy it, you find it makes a difference. So just putting joy and purpose together is fundamental.
Agreed. I just want to finish with this statement, really. It's come out of the book, and it's in your final chapter, David, as you kind of summarise it, and you talk about, you say, clearly we're not going to finish the business, the unfinished business that we're talking about, by trying to beat him. We have made too strong a case for him being unique, but we might do it by being more Tim. And at the back you said, for me, Tim was a classic example of either and rather than either or. He was a romantic who used the data, the statistician who could instill passion, the researcher who encouraged dreams. He was the person who was always busy and yet always had time for others. Tim got results and made lasting, significant and substantial change. He showed us how to be more Tim. He showed us the qualities that make a difference and, in doing so, set a path to make sure the business can be finished. And we want to really encourage everybody who, if you haven't got a copy of this book, you should buy it for people. It's coming up to Christmas. Perfect example. We'll put the link in the show notes to get hold of that. Mick told us earlier that the money goes to charity. And we are really grateful for your time this morning, both of you. And we're grateful for the life and legacy and the call to action that Tim gave us. So thank you for being people who walked in that direction and continue to walk in that direction, and telling us a story of somebody else who's done that as well. So thank you again for joining us on the Edufuturists podcast.
Thank you. And Merry Christmas, everyone.
Keep doing good things.
Join over 30,000 educators at London's Excel in January 2025 at Bet UK. Headlining the arena, we have Stephen Fry, Dan Fitzpatrick and Rose Luckin, to name just a few. There are 100 hours of CPD accredited sessions, from table talks to tech user labs, and over 600 exhibitors to inspire you with new technology for the new year. Educators, get your free ticket today at uk.betshow.com.